thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Getting Started with Web Personalisation. Personalisation isn't something new. It's a tactic that many marketers have heard about before, with well-known examples from companies such as Amazon at the forefront. But I suppose the key issue is where to begin. During today's presentation, we'll cover what is personalisation, why you should consider it as a tool to improve the overall customer experience, before moving on to actionable insights that help you get started with your first web personalisation project. So a bit about our speaker today. Steve Renshaw is Managing Partner at Ratio. Steve has worked with countless clients, helping them to align their business to their digital goals, working with organisations to create and optimise digital strategies needed to help organisations to reach their business objectives. Today's webinar has also been run in partnership with Sitecore. Sitecore is a global leading experience management platform with several thousands of customers and hundreds of delivery partners, as well as featuring as leaders in the Gartner Magic Quadrant and various Forrester reports for web content management and digital experiences for many years. A bit of housekeeping before we begin today's presentation. The session is being recorded, so you will receive a link to this in the next couple of days, along with a link to the slides for today's presentation. Today's presentation will last approximately 30 minutes, and we're allowing for about 10-15 minutes Q&A in total, so it should be finished within about 45 minutes. You can ask your questions by using the Q&A toolbar on the right-hand side as part of the GoToMeeting platform, and again, we'll answer your questions at the end of the 30-minute presentation. But it just leaves me at this point to hand over to Steve to begin today's webinar.
Great, thank you very much, Mario, and thanks everybody for joining today as well. We built the webinar that we're doing today off the back of a lot of experience working with Sitecore customers particularly, but also for speaking to both agencies and clients across multiple sectors who've tried to successfully or otherwise implement a personalization strategy. And what we're talking about today is really a summary of what we've seen work best through what we've seen with those projects. I think by now most people know that personalization is important, although I'm not going to let you completely escape the inevitable scene setting slides. But grasping the concepts of how to really approach a successful project can seem a bit like a dark art. It's very different in many respects to, if you like, traditional digital marketing or traditional marketing. And it does require a little bit of a new way of thinking just because of the mechanics that go behind it. And I'll cover off some of these a bit later. But really what I've tried to do is to include as many useful takeaways as I can in the time we have available today. So I hope you find it useful. But I wanted to start by going back to basics and touch on what personalization really is. What does it mean? And this is what I consider it to mean. It's delivering the most relevant experience at the right time and in the right context. But also, it's to create customers for life. And when we talk about customer experience, which is, if you like, the sort of holistic concept that personalization slots into, we do actually mean customer experience. And so when we talk about what isn't personalization, personalization isn't upsell, upsell, upsell. It's not an opportunity for you to consistently upsell to your customers, hammering them with emails, hammering them with offers, and so on. Actually, by creating personalized experiences that are genuinely useful to your customers, you're generating a value that's much, much larger. In fact, I think just this week or very recently, Bill McKitis from Slack, who've just seen extremely high levels of growth, said that they treat customer experience as central to the growth of their brand. In the long term. So not looking just in the short term, but looking further ahead in terms of making themselves useful to their customers and by virtue of that creating advocates and delivering further customer lifetime value from those users. So just a few scene setting statistics. I told you weren't going to get away from it completely. So Gartner has said that by 2017, 50% of product investment projects will be redirected to customer experience innovations. Walker Info have said that by 2020, customer experience will overtake price and product as the key brand differentiator, and I think it's something like 89% of marketers who've agreed with that. in terms of delivering customer lifetime value by increasing loyalty, loyal customers are 5 times as likely to repurchase, 5 times as likely to forgive you, 7 times as likely to try a new offering, and 4 times as likely to refer you. As you probably know, word of mouth being by far the best converting channel, if you like, for leads. And finally, just Gartner, 89% is that statistic I mentioned just now, of marketing leaders expect to compete primarily on the basis of customer experience by 2016, which is only about 3 weeks away, compared to 36% 4 years ago. And let's not just forget the customer side of this as well. There was a recent survey, I think, by Infosys earlier this year that it surveyed 5,000 consumers, and what they identified was that 78% of those respondents said they'd be more likely to buy from retailers if they were served with targeted, relevant offers. And also the CEB said recently that delighting customers doesn't build loyalty. Reducing the efforts, the work they must do to get the problem solved does. Basically, what they're saying here is that whereas previously customer experience specialists or customer service managers or people who are dealing with any kind of touch point were talking about delivering an excellent customer service that goes above and beyond customer expectations. Actually, what the customer wants is a service that meets their needs for what they want there and then. So in many respects, the concept of going above and beyond is actually what customers expect from you as a normal service now. And that's something to bear in mind when you're thinking about a personalization project, which is how can you make the customer's life easier? And just finally, a lot of questions that we field from clients is about, personalization sounds great, but actually I have a lot of problems with personalization myself. How do you get past the concept of stalking people? You're collecting an awful lot of data. This is a concept that's in the news constantly as well. How do you use that data in a way that you're not scaring your customers off and you are actually driving genuinely useful experiences for them? This is a great quote that I found the other day, which is, I don't want a relationship with my bank. I've got a relationship with my wife and family. I want efficient service from my bank. And another one down here I found, which was, I hate it when I visited a retail site and I'm bombarded with adverts from them every time I check my email for a fortnight afterwards. That's something I think probably a lot of us can relate to. So this is what I'm trying to get to, which is that customers want personalization on their own terms, not on yours. And if you've ever been through a web build project, if you've ever worked with a user experience agency or a digital agency, no doubt the term customer first has been chucked around the table numerous times. It's exactly the same concept for personalization as well. We need to be thinking about this from a customer's point of view and what they want, not what you want as an organization. Because what you want will come as a byproduct of what you're giving your customers. So how can we personalize to users? Well, we can look at the different options we have available. There's all sorts of tools out there that allows us to personalize a user's experience, and it's on the basis of all sorts of different conditions. In Sitecore's world, we call these personalization rules, but you may know them by a different name. And if you look at something like Sitecore's rules engine alone, there's over 100 rules you can use, so you have a massive wealth of choice to cater for almost pretty much every eventuality. So looking here, you can personalize based on device, and that might be something as simple as building a mobile site. Location, also another very common one. How do you identify which country a user's from and then serve them the relevant language or the relevant currency? And then all these other rules as well. How many times has the user visited our site? What demographic do they belong to? What content have they consumed? And therefore, what can we assume about those users? What goals have they triggered? What purchases have they made? And so on and so forth. And a whole heap of, perhaps bespoke rules that sit behind here as well that you've created yourself based on your own business, rules. And which channels can we personalize through? We look at the different touch points that we can use to affect a user's experience. So website, mobile, phone, email, print, in-store, face-to-face, app, through sales teams, and so on. And we're not necessarily going to start with everything from day one, but the point I'm making here is that personalization doesn't just touch on web or mobile. It can potentially use data or feed data back to all these different channels to ensure your communications aren't acting in silos, and you're always talking to the customer with an understanding of where they are in their journey with you. So that you're always talking to them about the next best action for that user. And how do we do that? Well, really we're looking at data. and I'm not going to get technical in today's webinar, but if you're familiar with Sitecore, or if you've seen any other tools out there, you'll know that data store, big data is another common term that's been thrown around, is hugely important to managing the consumption of information from all these different channels, but also using that data to feed back to those channels as well. So if I have data coming in from the website, can we send that out to our sales team to help enable them? Equally, if our sales team have a conversation with a customer, can we feed that data back into the user's profile in the website so that the next time they come back, we are personalizing their experience based on their offline experience with our sales team. And there was an interesting quote a while ago. I can't remember exactly who it was from, but it was saying that really true personalization is an incredibly data-intensive task. And it combines not just the data that you're collecting about your user there and then as they're interacting with you, but it's combining that with an immense amount of background and historical data, which you need to provide context. Because without the two, actually, both are almost meaningless. So you need to be able to use the historical data to put the user's context of personalization, into context. And you need to do that by having this data store that holds all that. And the chances are that if you're a high volume site or if you've been running for quite a time, that data store is going to get quite large. So you need something that's going to scale, and you need a way to allow all your silos to interrogate it. But as I say, this is an ideal world. What we're talking about really today is probably just the sort of web and email bit, but actually a lot of clients are now starting to plug in two-way data from CRMs. They're looking at pushing data out to call centers so that call center staff know what users are doing on the website, and so on and so forth. So we were looking at a utopian vision here, but this is the art of the possible. So getting down to the nitty-gritty of how we actually begin our personalization project. And as I said before, it is a project. In exactly the same way that you have a website build, you need to be thinking about personalization in exactly the same way. This isn't just something you can just switch on and play around with in between everything else that you're doing, if indeed you've even got time to do that. And most of our clients find that they're so stacked that they actually can't find the time to do this because A, they don't necessarily understand it, and B, they don't know how long it's going to take. So it does need to be treated as a project. And by that, what I mean is there's a whole bunch of phases that are built into it. So there's a lot of preparation work that needs to be done to make sure that your organization, that your technology is ready to start doing personalization, because as we just saw on the previous slides, this isn't necessarily just going to affect someone who's managing digital. It might also affect a myriad other teams across the organization. It needs to be scoped properly, so we need to have a plan in place. Off the back of the preparation work that we've done, and we'll talk a bit more about this in a second, scope or a roadmap or a plan that says, here's how our personalization strategy looks over the next month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and so on. And here's what we need to have in place in order to achieve that. And again, exactly the same way that you have iterative improvements to your website, exactly the same principles for personalization as well. If you don't have regular check-in points, if you're not rolling out continuously, you're just going to fail quickly. You've also got deployment phase, which in itself can be legwork, exactly the same way. For example, you have content entry, which is always the bane of every digital delivery project. And then finally, not forgetting measurement and optimization as well, because personalization in itself is great, but without a way to measure and optimize it effectively, again, it's just going to sit there ticking over, and it's never going to deliver that much business value to you on an ongoing basis. Just to really sort of head that off, and this is a mantra I sort of started when we began Ratio, which was you can't do this without a solid foundation, which is grounded in data, the data you already have within the organization, the planning process that we just looked at, and then the benchmarking or measurement. Those are kind of those three ingredients to really get started properly with personalization. And this is, if you like, my sort of 6 key things that every customer needs to think about when they're about to embark on a personalization project. The first might seem really obvious, but actually you'll be surprised how few people actually have a solid grasp on their analytics as it stands at the moment. People get reports once a week, once a month. There's little real-time understanding of what's happening on the site. And actually, it's often the case that we've seen that the business thinks that what users are doing on the website is actually quite different to what users actually are doing on the website. So, for example, a business that has a major service that they sell through their sales team offline, actually, I could cite a recent example, but for confidentiality, it turns out actually their online products that was the most popular with users turned out to be completely different. So it's very important that you understand this, because this is going to determine which user journeys we're looking at. It's going to determine which entry points of the site we're looking to personalize. It's going to determine which goals we're looking to impact on as well. So it's really key that we understand analytics from the get-go, and that we have this set up and giving us the information that we need. The second is almost as important, if not more important, and that's the business metrics we're trying to influence. I'll talk a bit more about this in a second and how we go about defining this. But really, it's going back to basics, and it's often difficult when you're head down day to day, working on your digital strategy, working on iterations to your website, doing email campaigns, and so on and so forth, to just be looking at things like click rates, bounce rates, form conversions, some quite basic data. Actually, what we need to be doing, if we're really going to show a return on investment for this kind of project, is what impact it's having on the business. If we're going to go to our CEO or CFO and say that we need X number of £1,000 to roll this out, and they don't understand it, we need to be able to say to those people, here's how it's going to impact on these statistics that matter to you, and not necessarily just click rates, which in themselves are meaningless to that kind of audience. Thirdly, do we know who the right stakeholders are, and can they affect change? One of the biggest problems we have is not only that a personalisation project isn't treated as a project, but also that the right people aren't involved. You've probably heard about the swing of technology ownership from IT to marketing. Actually, sales directors and commercial directors are a big part of this now as well, because everything we do ultimately affects, well, we want to affect, in most cases, the revenue that the business is achieving, the money that's in the bank. And I can't remember many meetings where those kind of people have actually been directly involved. So it's about identifying who the right stakeholders are, whereabouts they are in the business, whether they have the authority and ultimately the budget, and can they, importantly, affect the process and perhaps cultural change is going to be required. And again, we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But a great example is if you want to enable your sales team with a huge amount of personal data about users who are browsing your site, converting on forms, and so on. The sales team need to be able to digest that in the way that they want to, without necessarily disrupting the way they work. So it's about solving problems like that as well. There's no point doing that kind of work if it's never going to be used, and again, the project will fail. Do we understand our technology landscape? Probably a fairly simple one to understand, but again, it's really, if we're going to start doing targeted emails, do we understand what platform we're using, how we can use it, and so on. If we want to integrate with a CRM system, do we understand if that system is ready for us to integrate with? Do we have it set up so it can be used by users and it can be used to ingest the information we're giving it, and so on? So it's just maybe a small point, but it's cool to understand, and hopefully with the stakeholder piece, you'll cover that off and you'll actually understand and have access to the people who can give you that information. Number 5 is, what skills do we have, or what resources might we need? Again, it might seem like a fairly simple one, but you'll be surprised how many projects fail because there's a lack of expertise or there's a lack of resources. For example, if you want to do triggered emails as part of a personalization campaign to customers, you're going to struggle if you're not skilled up to actually create meaningful content that's going to excite users and get them to click through, and so on. So just things like that need to be considered when you're looking at a personalization project. And finally, do we really know our audience types, the journeys they're taking, and their touch points with us? So this is really just a mapping exercise, but it can take quite a while if you've never done it before. So looking at audience types, by which I mean segments. So we might have personas, such as high spender, low spender, medium spender. It might be by geography, it might be by job role, it might be a whole different series of facets depending on your business. Do we know the journeys they're taking through our site, again based on the analytics that we've looked at, and do we understand how they're interacting with us? What's their touch points that those users are going through when they connect with our organisation? But most importantly, I think, is going back to the business metrics, because this is going to define everything else that you do as part of your personalisation strategy. So it's amazing how this gets lost, and how eye-opening it is to sit in front of a client and take them back through this process and see how things have perhaps moved on, or how new priorities have come into play, and so on and so forth. But we start by looking at the strategic theme of the organisation. So what is it as a business we are here for? What is it? What is our purpose, our mission, if you like? And then below that, what objectives do we have as a business that feed into that? So what are our departmental objectives, whether it's increasing revenues, whether it's increasing the value of leads, whether it's increasing event attendance, whatever those objectives might be, they're all feeding into that strategic theme, which might be, to be the best of this kind of company in the UK. And then feeding into those objectives are the digital goals that contribute towards those. And I'll just give you a quick example. I've taken a banking customer that we've spoken to recently to understand what it is that they're trying to do, and taking them back through this process at a fairly high level. But the strategic thing was quite obvious. It's to be the #1 retail bank in the UK. So a very simple one-liner. So what's contributing towards that? Well, in this case, the business objectives that they have, but they got many, but actually two that we picked out here are increasing ISA opened accounts and the value of those accounts, and decreasing manual processing time. So, i.e., they spend a lot of time dealing with paperwork, and they wanted to reduce that time. Now, you'll notice that these aren't digital goals; these are just business goals, and actually, we haven't even touched on digital here yet. These are targets that belong to the director who owns this division of the business. But then we look at how digital can contribute towards that, and we can see that there's various different things that we can add. And so 3 that I've picked out here. So increasing the ISA lead form conversions, which is a fairly obvious one. Increasing brochures downloaded, which might seem like a bit of a weak goal, but actually for the purposes of the user journey, it's actually indicative of a user who's fairly engaged and is looking for information before they make a decision to purchase. So we included that as well. And then finally, we've included a qualitative metric rather than a quantitative one. And this is provide more data with leads. So when a user submits a form on the website, we can send all of their browsing history, the goals they've triggered, the videos they've looked at, the brochures that they've downloaded. That can all be sent off to the sales team that's dealing with their application. And that data that can then be used within the organisation to say, okay, we have someone here who's been looking at a lot of high-value content. We can keep that information and perhaps use it for something later. So this isn't something we can put a number against, but it is something we can put a yes or no against, and we'll see why that's useful in a second. So off the back of these metrics, you're going to have to look at your business, your KPIs, your benchmarks. So what is it that we're going to set as our target for our personalization strategy? And it's worth noting, and I've put it at the top here, that not all of your KPIs will be instantly achievable. So nothing's going to be completely achievable on day one. Any personalization project is going to take time to implement, to optimize, to measure, and to roll out. So you need to have these in your mind, but you need to also, as part of that scoping roadmap that we said earlier, be thinking about when these KPIs are going to be achievable and what are the targets that we're going to assign to them. So if we have a look here, we have the ability to, for example, use Google Analytics to set where we are now versus where we want to be. So again, just using that data that we already have. It might also be using those business metrics. So if we're looking at the number and value of applications, then maybe we can work with our our sales team there to get that data from them, and again work with them to put a target against it that they want to achieve as well. So again, not just looking at digital, but also looking at the wider business implications as well. And like I said, some KPIs may be more qualitative than quantitative, but they may impact higher up the chain. So it's really important to get that business objective data so that we can think about what targets we can put against them. I've put a quick rule in here as well, just saying there's no real hard and fast rule. People have asked me in the past, if we implement personalization across this journey here, what sort of impact should we be looking at for our form? It's finger in the air. It's the same as any kind of forecast or target. You'll get a hang of it as you go along, and if you look online, there's so many different stats out there, varying from 20% increase in sales down to 2%, up to 60%, and so on. So it's going to depend on your business. It's going to depend on how mature you are. It's going to depend on how far you're rolling out personalization, but also how well you're managing the optimization of it as well. So just to relate it back to that banking example, we might have KPIs here, such as we're going to increase an ISA lead form conversion by 2%, which is a fairly modest increase. We're going to increase brochure downloads by 5%, again, which might number into the hundreds. And we're going to provide more data with leads, and we're going to set a target of giving our sales team data on whether a customer is high value, medium value, or low value at some point in the next 6 months, and that is our target for this project. But we're also going to relate it back to the business, and this is really the powerful reporting that we can take back to our CEO. So looking at the value of opened ISA accounts off the back of these goals on the left-hand side have actually attributed to digital an increase of £600,000 over 3 months. In terms of business efficiencies, something which is often lost in this process, because personalisation can actually be crucial to improving things like self-service, and decreasing the amount of customer service work you have to do manually. In this case, you might say, well, it saves 2 weeks or a month's time over that period. And then compared to our project cost of 20k, you don't need to be a scientist to see that there's a good return on investment case there, and also a case to roll this out further and get more budget and authority to expand it across the organisation as well. It's also very good using these kind of stats to show value to people who may be slightly, perhaps, political or slightly resistant to these kind of projects. If you involve them from the get-go, then they can start to see the value of this as well, and these kind of metrics bring it to life for them. Which brings me on to stakeholders. So if we're looking at who we need to be involved in a project, it's very easy to think that as a digital manager we can run off and do this ourselves. What we'll probably find is that trying to sell this into the business and getting budget approved for it is a slightly more complex process, and that's for a variety of reasons, some of which I've put here. It's going to be a new concept for a lot of people, especially sales teams who, just by virtue of their nature, usually think they are always right and their way is best. So you may have to think about, well, how do we position this to show value to them? You're going to come across politics of ownership, almost certainly, especially when you're talking about fiddling around with a homepage or key landing pages. So it's about getting the message right for those stakeholders to say, well, okay, if we bring in sales or events or training and the people responsible for those areas, we are going to put this personalization on the homepage, or maybe 30% of the homepage, and here's how it's going to impact you by directing your users through to your service. And that's a very good way of sort of making people realize that actually this isn't just a project that you're doing to their detriment, it's actually something that's going to benefit them as well. I'm going to rate on a little bit because I'm just conscious of time, but the others on here you can read. Process and cultural change I've spoken about, budget, time and resources I've spoken about, and project priorities. So trying to get the right people in the room so that you don't come across these. And these people have the authority to direct the project and to buy into it, to really understand what value it can bring to the organisation. So we're looking at fairly senior people, depending on the kind of organisation, and ultimately it will float or sink a project, because it only takes a marketing director to suddenly decide they want to do a campaign tomorrow that's going to put a hole right in the middle of your personalisation project. Just very quickly, looking at the journeys and touch points that users have with our organization. When a user goes through a buying process, they're going through a discovery, explore, and then they eventually buy. And then they're going through a usage of the service, engagement with the company, and eventually, we hope, advocacy as well. And in each of those different stages, they're having different touch points with our organization through various different channels. So for our ISA buyer, for example, it might be seeing a leaflet in a bank. It might be then coming to visit our website. It might then be going on to check other banks' deals, coming back to the website again to have a look and look at trust information. It might be downloading a brochure. They might then be phoning an advisor and eventually submitting an application online. And again, you're not going to be able to track all this activity from day one. Unless you're very mature already. There's a lot there, but actually there's a lot we can do just taking one facet of that, such as the website, and then applying a personalization journey there. If you haven't seen this already, it's the customer experience maturity model. This is a very, very good way of aligning yourself against your digital maturity, something I've mentioned a couple of times. If you want these slides afterwards, my email's at the end and I can send this through to you. But essentially, you're aligning where you are as an organization digitally, or even as a business actually, beyond digital, and then where you need to get to, and then the kind of activities you need to be thinking about in order to move you along that journey. And just moving towards some final points. One of the things I wanted to give you off the back of this presentation was how to tackle a quick wins project. So where do you get started? How do you go about it? How long will it take? What kind of activities will you need to do? And like I said, you do need to treat it as a project. So there is, if you like, these 4 phases. And POC, by the way, is proof of concept, because one of the best ways to go about testing personalization is to rapidly and agilely roll it out and test it so that you can show value in a very short space of time. And that's what this process that Ratio have built out is designed to accomplish. It's to get something live for you in a very short space of time. So if we look at the kind of tasks, you'll recognize a lot of this from the points I made earlier, but it's being able to prepare for a project, so making sure the technology is ready, you understand analytics, you understand your objectives and so on. It's moving into perhaps a workshop phase where you're getting all those stakeholders around the table and you're actually mapping all that out. You're agreeing your objectives, your business metrics, you're looking at the people, you're looking at the processes, the risks, timescales and so on. And off the back of that, you'll have a scope. So this is, if you like, your plan. And this will importantly tell you what you can do now versus what you can do in the coming months and perhaps even years. And what you're going to need to support that in terms of technology, time, cost, resources, and so on. But then really off the back of that saying, well, okay, we know what we can do now, and we're going to roll out a proof of concept either in our live environment or just in a demo environment, so we can just prove that it works, show it to the teams and the stakeholders that it's going to affect, get their feedback perhaps before then rolling it into live. So this kind of process, at least with Sitecore, can take anything between sort of 5, 6, 7, 8 maybe days, depending on the complexity. But the idea is that within a short space of time, you can get that planning done, you can get something live, and actually, for a business, that's not a lot of money to spend on something that's potentially going to have a huge amount of impact on your bottom line. And a sample proof of concept might look a little bit like this. So off the back of all the planning that we've done, off the back of the scoping and so on, this might be a snapshot of one of those things that we've chosen to do a proof of concept around. So in this case, we've picked out a persona, we've picked out a user journey, and we've said what we want to do is increase form conversions for Saver Sam's journey. Like, this is our user who's buying an ISA or investing in an ISA. Here's the target, here's where we want to get it to, 3%. And then what we do is to map out, okay, well, now we know what it is we're trying to achieve, then here's how we're going to do it. And in this case, we've looked at it by journey point. So we know that when a user's coming from a leaflet onto our website, we've got a campaign code that's working in the background that's triggering a high-value content header. And I say high-value because the user's taken a conscious decision to come to the landing page off the back of a leaflet. We might say if they visit a second time, then that's a trigger for us to then provide them with trust information and offer them a brochure download, because that's likely to be the kind of information they're looking at, having already been off to these other touch points and looked at other banks and so on. Once they've downloaded a brochure, we know they're a pretty hot lead, and so we might want to say, well, why don't you fill in an application form or give us a call? And when they finally converted on that form, we're going to register that and then say, okay, now we know you've submitted interest in our ISA products. We're not going to keep trying to sell you that. What we're going to do is tell you what happens next. So going back to what I said at the very, very beginning, this is all about providing the customer with the optimal experience, the most optimal experience possible for the point of the journey that they're at. And here we're just doing it really through the website, but actually we could bring in the future all sorts of other facets to this, such as CRM, such as sales teams, and so on and so forth. But this is just, an example, quick win that we could help define. And just finally, remember to measure and optimize. Don't forget to set those benchmarks. And remember, you're not always going to get it right first time. But it is important to have a platform such as Sitecore that's going to allow you to constantly monitor your data and look at how you can evolve your personalization strategy. Because without that, your robust foundation that we discussed earlier is almost meaningless, really. Sitecore gives you the tools to do A/B testing and multivariate testing, but also to see how particular personalization experiences are performing as well. And even if we go into analytics, potentially even particular segments. And if you get really, really advanced, you might want to start looking at even bringing in business intelligence tools or looking at the functionality that's coming in future versions of Sitecore as well. So I've gone on a little bit longer than I anticipated, but we have just a little bit of time now for some Q&A if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. Otherwise, my details are also on the screen should you want to get in touch.
Thank you very much, Steve. We've got actually quite a few questions come in. Please continue to input your questions, and we'll do our best to try and answer them during today's session. So the first question, we had a great one come in from Angie. We'd love to implement personalization in our B2B company, but we have so many different personas per area of interest that we feel it will be too complex. Where do you feel we should start? I imagine it's an issue that lots of organizations must feel overwhelmed where to begin.
Yeah, and I think, the slightly trite answer is to just take one of those personas and work out what you can do to optimize their journey. B2B is a really interesting sector because I meet a lot of B2B digital managers who think that they perhaps don't attribute much value or as much as they could to the organization. And I actually look at it completely differently and think that, with personalization, you can actually do a huge amount to try and influence people through the buying process. When they're coming back onto your site, they're looking for that kind of trust messaging and so on. So the way I would approach that is having gone through that workshop process, is to define maybe one or two of those audience segments. In fact, we're actually doing this with an association at the moment, and saying, well, okay, what are those people interested in? What are they doing? So who's the audience? What's the goal? And then we look at the user journey that they're taking to get there. Who are they talking to? What content are they consuming? And so on. So then we have a picture of that entire journey. And then we can say, right, okay, now how can we optimize that journey? So where can we bring in personalization? If we're going a bit further down the line, where can we bring in marketing automation and start triggering out emails? So the key to all of this is you're never going to start doing everything at once, and you're right, you will have a huge amount of work. The trick is to start with just focusing on one or two and then prove the concept and roll it out from there.
Okay, thank you, Steve. On to the next question. What skills do we need in order to start a personalization project?
It depends on what exactly you want to get started with. So I mentioned earlier, for example, if you want to create personalized emails or indeed even personalized content, the chances are you're going to need someone who has the ability to create compelling content, which in itself is a skill, and many people have dedicated copywriters, content writers, and so on. So it really depends on the kind of project, but it could be anything from email marketing to content creation to marketing automation skills to CRM skills and so on.
Okay, thank you. On to question 3. Is there a good solution you can recommend for making consistent personalized experiences for individuals across their multiple devices?
Well, yes. If I understand the question correctly, I think you mean if you're on a desktop and you're looking at a website, and then you go onto a mobile and you're looking at the website. There's a couple of ways of doing that. First is obviously through login, so that you can track people. If you're doing it anonymously, it's quite difficult because obviously it's based on cookies in Sitecore's case, and so it's very difficult to join up that journey unless you have some way of joining up those cookies. Another good way to look at it is to give the user an email, for example, with a link that relates back to their profile, so that when they click on that link, it takes them back to the website, and they recognize who that user is. So that's a couple of potential ways of doing it.
Okay, thank you. I do have a question. How much data do you need in order to personalise?
As little or as much as you can handle, really. The bigger the better, but with that comes complications in terms of management, in terms of how do you analyse that data meaningfully, how do you interrogate it, and so on. You can do a lot with Google Analytics data probably already, and that would generally be my advice. That's probably your starting point. If you can cope with that, then build it out from there. But yeah, I mean, really, the more the better. The more data you have, and you have a technology that can make sense of it for you, such as Sitecore, it actually makes it a lot easier to control the data. So I guess the simple answer is as much as you can get, and then let the technology translate it for you into something that's meaningful.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one more question, Steve. We've got one come in. Our organisation provides information as opposed to selling a specific product or service. Is it possible to track and measure this knowledge transfer? I suppose
just to quickly repeat that, please, Mary.
Yeah, we provide information as opposed to selling a specific product or service. Is it possible to track and measure knowledge transfer? I suppose it's for, as I understand the question, it's an organisation which doesn't, I suppose, like a retailer which sells a specific product, and
yeah.
I suppose if you're more sort of thing that some B2B companies who don't give away, say, free content, for example, in exchange for data, is how you measure that impact.
So yeah, I mean, I guess in that example, you're almost thinking of content as your product. So I would treat it in almost the same respect. A good example is if you have someone coming onto your website, and your goal is to get them to consume content, then you can attribute, for example, within Sitecore, things like goals to that content. So when they watch a video, for example, you can say, right, okay, that user is particularly interested in that type of content, and then you can use that to personalize their journey thereafter. You can also do things like sharing as well. So you can register when someone has liked, for example, an organization, or liked a bit of content that you sent out, and again, you can use that as a way to recognize perhaps the kind of content they're interested in. If you're using Sitecore as well, as a content author, you can also use Sitecore to post content out to social networks such as Facebook and Twitter and so on, and then measure what's happening to that content thereafter. So you can see how many likes and retweets and things it's had, and also perhaps how many people have clicked from that content on social back into your site, and then what they've been doing off the back of that. What goals have they been triggering and so on. So there's various ways to sort of to answer that question, but I hope that covers some of it.
Thank you, Steve. That brings the Q&A session, part of our webinar today, to a close, and in fact that's the end of today's webinar. I just want to thank everyone who took the time to attend and view and ask questions. If we were unable to answer your questions today, we will get back to you with a detailed answer within 24 hours. And just to remind everyone, today's session is recorded, and we will send out a recording as well as a link to today's slides within a couple of days. So thank you very much for your attendance today.